All right, now joining us on the broadcast, we've got Mr. Nadir Hashmi, who's an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at Georgetown University. Professor, thank you very much for joining us here on WION. Now, this, of course, is a big moment. You know, that meeting that Donald Trump was having with his close, trusted aides and other top officials in the United States, we're given to understand has come to an end. The big question, of course, is this. Looking at what Donald Trump has put out on his social media posts, saying that we have complete control over the Iranian airspace and that we are not going to assassinate the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei at this moment. In your assessment, how close do you think the United States under Donald Trump is in jumping into this war?
Well, it looks like they have come to the precipice of entering this war. Whether they will cross over into an active military role, we'll find out, I suspect, within the next 48 hours. But based on what Donald Trump has been saying, all indication seems to be that he wants to go to war with Iran. And, you know, I have to share with your viewers, this all sounds eerily reminiscent of the lead up to the 2003 Iraq war invasion. Very similar claims were made, very similar arguments, a very similar level of hubris and arrogance from the Americans, thinking that they can solve the problems of the Middle East through raw military power. We saw what happened in Iraq. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. We saw what happened in Libya. And unfortunately, it looks like that story is going to repeat itself in Iran as well.
That is very true. The premise with which the Americans seem to be operating on is precisely that. But on the ground, though, in the last 5 days that this war, hot war between Iran and Israel has been ongoing, there is a very different reality that the Americans are looking at this moment, because Iran of 2025 is very different from the Iraqis of 2003. The missile capability that the Iranians have at this moment put out in front of the world, do you think that has taken the Americans and the Israelis by surprise?
Well, they've been able to, that is, the Iranian government has been able to show some ability to hit back at the Israelis. But if you look at the overall balance of power, it favors Israel. So those missiles that Iran has been able to send toward Israel, you know, they've killed, last time I checked, I think about 34 people, half of them, people of Palestinian and Arab descent, because Israel is an apartheid state and it doesn't provide bomb shelters for its Arab citizens in the same way it does for its Jewish citizens. So Iran's, missiles are an irritant, but I think my read of what Washington is saying and what the Israeli government is saying is they feel that they're in the driver's seat, that they have Iran on its back heels. If you want to use the analogy of a boxer in a ring, they feel that Iran is on the ropes, and all it needs is one heavy strike to knock it down. So that's where it seems like things are heading, and I don't think these ballistic missiles in the end are going to make that much of a difference, because as Trump has said, and I'm assuming it's true, that the United States and Israel has control over the skies of Iran. Iran doesn't have an air force. It doesn't have an air defense system that seems to be working. And I think the Americans think that time is on their side the more that they prosecute this war on behalf or with Israel. So I think that the United States is hoping they can prevail, and those ballistic missiles will not be able to fire with the same regularity and consistency as they have been firing for the first 5 days of this war.
Interesting. So it is 5 days of this war, and if you were to watch what the Western media is, of course, showing, it does look like the Iranians do not stand a chance. But for people who are looking at the imagery of these ballistic missiles that the Iranians have in fact fired, where some of the most crucial infrastructure in Haifa has been bombed. For instance, that very crucial oil and gas refining facility in Haifa has been put out of action. We've never witnessed the kind of damage that's been inflicted by the Iranians on a city like Tel Aviv. You know, the aura of invincibility that the Israelis had developed over the course of the last 7 decades seems to have taken a bit of a dent. What's your assessment?
No, that's all true. Israel has never been bombed like it has been bombed over the last 5 days. But from my reading of Israeli politics and society, there is this belief that Iran poses such an existential threat to Israel that it's worth paying that price. That if we could only, suffer this pain, in the end, it will be worth it for Israel to continue this war in the hope that on the other side, the Iranian regime won't exist anymore and Israel will be more safer, and thus the Middle East will be more safe for Israel. I think that's a miscalculation, but that's very much the mainstream view in Israel. So while these Iranian missiles have been causing destruction in Israel and killing people, overwhelmingly the destruction in this war is on the Iranian side. There's no parallel or equivalence. And I think the Israelis, at least Netanyahu's, position on this is, well, let's just absorb those blows as a necessary price to pay to try and destroy the Islamic Republic.
The point you're making is absolutely well taken. There is literally no comparison between the military capabilities of what Iran can do and what the Israelis, who are backed by the Americans, and Americans supply them with military hardware, can actually do. The Americans and the Israelis have a much superior military. That's a fact. But Netanyahu is relying on the Americans intervening. Netanyahu's entire strategy seems to be that he starts off this war with Operation Rising Lion, but he wants the Americans to jump in. Now, every single war that Israel has been involved in the last 7 decades, the Americans have fought with it. It is 5 days in this war. What do you think is keeping the Americans from not getting more directly involved?
Well, I think Donald Trump campaigned on a platform of being an anti-war president. Recall when he was in Saudi Arabia just recently in May, he gave a big speech about how previous U.S. administrations tried to engage in regime change and nation building, and how that was a disaster. He even referenced Iran, suggesting that they can make a deal. So Donald Trump has a problem of his own credibility and legitimacy here. Segments of his own MAGA movement are very upset with the possibility of an American intervention in Iran because this is an anti-war coalition. It's many of those people who paid the price when soldiers were set over. So that's, I think, somewhat of a constraint. But I think Trump's inner circle, I think all of the Republican congressmen and women are egging Trump on to go and take advantage of this opportunity. What they're telling Trump is, look, Iran is on its back heels. We can knock them out, and then we can claim the Middle East as ours, and you will be the king of this region, Donald Trump. At least not formally, but at least informally. You can lay claim to redrawing the political map of the Middle East, and everyone will sing your praises. I think Donald Trump has a big ego. This is what he's hearing. I think he imagines that this will be the case. Of course, it'll be very different in my estimation, but I think these are the things that are sort of Donald Trump is wrestling with before he makes a final decision as to entering this war or not.
Wars always have unintended consequences. It's difficult to predict as to what the consequence of this war is. But looking at the statement that Donald Trump made, where he said that we know where the Iranian supreme leader is, we can assassinate him very easily if we want, but we're choosing not to. But this is, of course, the crux of the question. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is 87 years old. There is a clear line of succession. There are names that are being put out as to who is likely to succeed him if it comes to that. Do you think taking out Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has any consequence in this war?
Well, it would be a psychological blow to the supporters of the Islamic Republic. Obviously, he is the most powerful figure in the system. So if he is somehow killed or assassinated, then I think it would shake the system, but I don't think it would topple it. The United States and the Israelis and their supporters don't understand that while this is a very authoritarian regime, a very brutal regime with a horrific human rights record, it has a deep crisis of legitimacy that it faces within the eyes of its own people, particularly young people. At the same time, it does have a base of support of people who are willing to fight and die for it, and people whose economic interests are tied to the existence of this political system. So taking off the supreme leader is not going to lead to regime collapse. Iran is not like Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. It's a much more complicated system, and there are segments of society who support the regime. So they're not going to all wither away and just step aside and let the baby Shah of Iran, who lives in Washington, D.C. and wants to return to Iran, to come back to claim control of the country on the back of an American or Israeli tank. if that's what the Americans are thinking or the Israelis are thinking, they need to think again. The other factor here is Iranian nationalism. Like even people who don't like the regime and are very critical of it have a deep sense that Iran is part of the global South. Iran's modern identity has been deeply shaped by the imperial and colonial intervention in part of the world that has shaped and changed regimes and created mayhem and chaos. And so this is a foundational sort of aspect of, who Iranians are. There's a long history that we could just talk about on Iran alone and its troubled relationship with the West, specifically, related to regime change. In 1953, your listeners should know, there was a democracy in Iran, or at least an emerging democracy, and the CIA toppled it and installed a brutal dictator who set the stage for the 1979 revolution that brought the revolutionaries to power. So this is all very well known in Iran, and simply removing the supreme leader is not going to produce a pro-American regime or pro-American regime in its aftermath. Far from it. The likelihood would be probably another Libya, another Iraq.
Indeed, I think you've summed it up really well. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Nader Hashmi, for joining us with our perspective there.
Thank you.